China just put a flying car on the market for $4,937. That is cheaper than many used cars on the road today. And for the first time, the old dream of personal flight no longer feels like something trapped in science fiction. But the price is not the real story. The real story is how China got here while the rest of the world was still testing prototypes, raising money, and waiting for regulators to catch up. For more than a century, flying cars were promised again and again. America imagined them. Startups pitched them, but almost none of them became something ordinary people could actually use. China took a different path. It did not just build a flying car. It built the system around it. Manufacturing, regulation, autonomous software, battery supply chains, and public trust. This is not just about one cheap flying vehicle. It is about autonomous transportation, electric aviation, and the future of mobility. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story about the technology changing our world. The flying car dream that never took off. The strange thing about flying cars is that they were never supposed to feel new. For more than a century, people were told that transportation would not stay on the ground. Cars would rise above traffic, families would fly across cities, and highways would move into the sky. The flying car became one of the most repeated promises in modern technology, always close, always coming, always just one breakthrough away. America had been imagining this future since at least 1917. That means more than a century of promises, prototypes, investor decks, and futuristic headlines. And still, almost nothing ordinary people could actually buy. In 1946, Waldo Waterman built one of the first serious attempts, a three-wheeled aircraft that could drive on roads and take off from a runway. Magazines called it the future. But the future never shipped. Decades passed. The dream survived, but the product did not. Every few years, another company appeared with another prototype, another test flight, and another promise that this time would be different. Then came 2012. That year, Terrafugia completed a successful test flight of a real flying car. It was not just a drawing, it actually flew. And in the same year, Tesla launched the Model S. Two impossible-sounding ideas, but they went in completely different directions. Tesla became one of the most valuable car companies on Earth, and electric cars moved from niche technology into the mainstream. Governments and investors turned toward batteries, charging networks, and cleaner roads. Terrafugia went the other way. It never launched a mass-market consumer product. It was later acquired by a Chinese company in 2017, and most people barely noticed. That contrast matters. While the West was learning how to electrify the car, China was watching the flying car dream from another angle. It was not asking only how to make cars cleaner. It was asking how to move transportation into the sky. China decided to build an industry around that question. How China turned the sky into a new market. While the West was still trying to make the flying car dream work, China started asking a different question. Not just, can we build a vehicle that flies? But, how do flying vehicles become everyday transportation? That difference changed everything. Because a flying car does not enter the world the way a normal car does. You cannot just build it, put it on sale, and expect the market to figure out the rest. It needs rules, routes, landing points, traffic control, charging systems, flight software, and regulators willing to open the sky. In other words, the vehicle was never the whole problem. The real challenge was building the world around it. China understood that earlier than most. Instead of treating flying cars as a futuristic toy, China placed low-altitude aviation at the center of a much larger economic plan. That means everything flying through the lower sky drones, electric air taxis, cargo aircraft, emergency vehicles, autonomous passenger pods, and eVTOL aircraft operating below a few thousand feet. To most countries, that sounded like a niche industry. To China, it looked like the next layer of transportation. So the country began building for it with policy, manufacturing, battery supply chains, carbon fiber, autonomous software, testing zones, and regulation designed to move with the technology. China was not waiting for one heroic startup to solve the flying car problem alone. It was creating an ecosystem where many companies could test, fail, improve, and scale at the same time. Once that ecosystem existed, the timeline changed. While many Western companies were still testing aircraft and waiting for certification pathways, China was preparing the sky itself for commercial use. By 2023, that strategy produced a result the flying car industry had been chasing for decades. China certified the world's first autonomous electric air taxi for commercial operation. Not a concept, not a lab experiment, not another promise for the future. A certified aircraft allowed to carry paying passengers. That is why the $4,937 flying car did not come out of nowhere. It was the visible result of years of policy, engineering, software, manufacturing scale, and regulatory preparation. The flying car with no pilot inside. When most people imagine a flying car, they usually imagine control. They picture a cockpit, a joystick, a dashboard full of screens, and maybe even a steering wheel that somehow works in the sky. In their mind, the future is still built around one familiar idea: a person sitting at the front, guiding the machine through the air. But China's first real breakthrough did not follow that vision. The vehicle that pushed this story into the real world is called the EHang EH216-S. And the most surprising thing about it is not how futuristic it looks. It is how much it removes from the experience. There is no pilot seat, no familiar driving position, and no set of controls that makes the passenger feel in charge. Instead, the EH216-S places two people inside a small autonomous cabin and turns the flying car into something completely different. Not a vehicle you operate, but a vehicle you enter. Not a machine you command, but a system you trust. At first, that feels strange, but the idea is closer to an elevator. You press a button, the doors close, and the system takes over. The trust is invisible because the technology has become normal. The EH216-S is built around that same logic. Passengers choose from approved routes, and once the flight begins, the aircraft handles the rest. Its autonomous system, supported by ground control, manages altitude, navigation, speed, and landing. The person inside is not making decisions in the air. The aircraft is. That is what makes the EH216-S both impressive and unsettling. For more than a century, flying car stories were built around the fantasy of personal control. The EH216-S does the opposite. It asks passengers to give up control completely. From takeoff to landing, this is not a flying car for amateur pilots. It is an autonomous transport pod that happens to move through the sky, and that is why its certification mattered so much. In October 2023, the EHang EH216-S became the first autonomous electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft to receive full type certification from China's Civil Aviation Administration. This was not just permission for another test flight or another controlled demonstration. It was certification for commercial operation. That changed the meaning of the aircraft. It could begin carrying paying passengers on approved routes, tourism flights, short urban trips, real services with people inside. And once those flights began, the most important part of the story was no longer the machine itself. It was the people willing to step into it. Ordinary passengers climbed inside a cabin with no controls in front of them. They let the doors close, lifted into the air, and trusted software, sensors, and ground control to bring them safely back down. That is the real breakthrough. China did not simply build an aircraft that could fly without a pilot. It built one of the first flying vehicles ordinary people were willing to trust with their lives. Why the West got stuck on the ground. To understand why China moved so fast, you first have to look at what the West spent years trying to make real. The flying car industry was never short of ambition. Companies like Terrafugia, Lilium, Archer, Joby, and Whisk all carried some version of the same promise. Personal flight was finally close. But turning that promise into a real commercial product proved far harder than the headlines made it sound. Some ran into funding problems. Others built aircraft too complex, too expensive, or too difficult to certify quickly. The West did not fall behind because it lacked talent. Western engineers built serious machines and solved serious technical problems. But too many were building aircraft for a world that did not exist yet, a world with clear rules, ready infrastructure, trained operators, landing networks, and regulators prepared to approve a new category of flight. China watched all of that happen, and instead of trying to copy the most ambitious Western designs, it learned from where they broke. When some Western companies chased sleek aircraft that looked like mini private jets, Chinese companies moved towards simpler multi-rotor designs. When Western startups focused on pilots, China pushed harder toward autonomy. When American companies moved through certification systems still being defined, China built the aircraft and the rulebook in parallel. That difference matters, because the flying car was never just an aircraft problem. It was a system problem. Flight was only the visible part. Underneath it had to be batteries, carbon fiber, software, regulation, testing, and factories all moving together. China built that floor first. Battery supply chains, carbon fiber production, autonomous flight systems, testing environments, and dozens of companies moving at the same time. That is why the $4,937 price tag matters. It is not just a cheap vehicle. It is what happens when an entire manufacturing system spends years pushing the cost of flight downward. The West spent decades trying to perfect the flying car. China built the conditions that allowed one to operate, and that may be the real advantage. China did not win by building the flashiest flying car. It won by building the ground beneath it. Who gets flying cars first and why it matters? When a new technology enters the world, the first buyers usually show where it actually makes sense. And with flying cars, the first serious customers are not thrill seekers, billionaires, or ordinary commuters trying to fly over traffic on the way to work. At least, not yet. The first real buyers are the people with problems that roads cannot solve easily. Logistics operators moving cargo across mountains, islands, rivers, and rural regions. Emergency services trying to reach remote communities faster. Infrastructure inspection teams monitoring power lines, pipelines, bridges, wind farms, and industrial sites without sending helicopters into the air every time. Tourism companies turning short scenic flights into a new kind of experience. These buyers are not purchasing flying cars because they look futuristic. They are buying them because they may be the cheapest solution to an expensive problem they already have. Helicopters can do some of these jobs, but they are costly to operate, require trained pilots, and need specific infrastructure. A flying car or autonomous air taxi can be smaller, cheaper, easier to deploy, and better suited for routes that repeat again and again. And once operators begin using them, something powerful happens. The technology leaves the showroom and enters the real world. Every route teaches the system something. Every landing improves the software. Every passenger trip builds trust. That is the advantage China is building. Hundreds of certified aircraft are not just products, they are data machines. They train the ecosystem with real flights, real passengers, real routes, and real operating pressure. Once that ecosystem forms, it becomes hard to replace. Landing zones are chosen, schedules are built, teams are trained, and customers get used to it. At that point, China is not just selling flying cars. It is selling the infrastructure lock-in that comes with them. The first buyers are not the end of the market. They are the beginning of the system. The sky is becoming the next road. The EHang EH216-S proved that an autonomous flying vehicle could carry real passengers, but it was only the opening act. The next thing China built looked much closer to the flying car people had imagined for decades. It is called the XPeng land aircraft carrier, and the name is almost literal. There is a ground module, a full-size electric vehicle that drives on normal roads. And there is a flying module, a 6-propeller electric aircraft that can detach, lift off vertically, fly, land, fold back down, and reconnect to the vehicle. For more than a century, flying car companies struggled with the same problem. What makes a vehicle good at driving usually makes it bad at flying. XPeng did not force one machine to do everything. It split the problem in two. One vehicle for the road, one aircraft for the sky. Together, they become something different. Not exactly a car, not exactly a drone, not exactly a helicopter, but a new category of personal aviation. That is why the nearly 5,000 pre-orders matter. This is not just a futuristic demo. Real buyers have already put down deposits for a vehicle most of the world has barely heard of. At under $280,000, the land aircraft carrier enters a space normally occupied by light helicopters, except helicopters need trained pilots, helipads, higher operating costs, and specialized infrastructure. XPeng's design points to a future where flying is not separate from the road, but connected to it, and China is not stopping there. While people were still trying to process the idea of a modular flying car, another Chinese company, AutoFlight, unveiled something even larger, the Matrix. A fully electric aircraft weighing about 5 tons with a wingspan of 66 feet and space for 10 passengers. Not a sketch, not a render, and not a concept trapped inside a promotional video. A real aircraft built inside the same ecosystem that produced the world's first certified autonomous air taxi. That is when the story stops being about one flying car. It becomes about an entire transportation layer. China calls it the low-altitude economy, a new market built above roads, bridges, railways, and city streets. It includes drones, air taxis, cargo aircraft, emergency vehicles, inspection systems, personal flying vehicles, batteries, software, landing sites, and airspace management. In other words, China is not just trying to sell a product, it is trying to organize the sky. China's low-altitude economy is projected to reach 3.5 trillion yuan by 2035. Industry groups have projected up to 100,000 autonomous drones, flying cars, and electric air taxis over Chinese cities by 2030. Those numbers may sound almost impossible, but that is exactly the point. China is planning for scale before the rest of the world has even decided what this market should become. The $4,937 flying car caught the world's attention because of its price. But the XPeng land aircraft carrier changed the story because it looked impossible. The AutoFlight matrix made the industry look bigger than most people imagined. China is not just trying to put cars in the sky. It is trying to turn the sky into the next road. The $4,937 flying car was never really about one cheap machine. It was about a shift that has been building quietly for years. For more than a century, flying cars were treated like a promise that never arrived. They appeared in drawings, prototypes, investor pitches, and headlines, but almost always stopped before ordinary people could use them. China is trying to break that pattern, not by building one perfect flying car, but by building the world around it. Factories, batteries, autonomous software, certification, routes, and trust. The EHang air taxi, the XPeng land aircraft carrier, and China's low-altitude economy are pieces of the same larger plan, turning the space above roads into a new layer of movement. So the question is no longer whether flying cars can exist. They already do. The question is, who can make them useful, affordable, and normal? And right now, China is moving faster than anyone else. What do you think? Is this the beginning of a real transportation revolution? Or just another version of an old dream? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the technology changing our world, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.